The harsh winds of January swept through Fifth Avenue, barely illuminating the skyscrapers of Manhattan with the last light of dusk. Barbara Wilson raised the collar of her worn coat and hid her frozen fingers inside her sleeves. Once, she had watched the same skyscrapers from the comfort of a temperature-controlled office, but now they loomed over her like monuments of an unreachable past. Near the entrance to Central Park, Barbara's eyes caught two figures. An old man clutching a tattered cardboard with weather-beaten hands, and a young mother sleeping under layers of donated clothes, cradling a small child. Unconsciously, Barbara reached into her pocket for the paper bag containing a sandwich she had just received from a local volunteer, still warm. Without hesitation, she approached them. Her demeanor carried a dignity not typical of someone living on the streets. "Would you care to join me?" she asked, her voice calm yet commanding. Despite her frozen fingertips, she elegantly divided the sandwich into three. The old man looked up, his eyes a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. "Young lady, I couldn't possibly." "Please," Barbara interrupted softly. "Sharing is our pride." She handed him the sandwich wrapped in a clean napkin she had saved. The young mother, tears welling up in her eyes, accepted her portion and whispered a small thank you as she gently woke her child. Tourists and businessmen passing by paused to observe the scene. Some appeared uncomfortable, while others looked on with interest, but Barbara, sitting gracefully on the cold ground beside the old man and young mother, seemed unaffected, as if she were in a fine dining restaurant. "We may not have the luxury to share." Barbara's voice resonated in the crisp winter air. "But we have our pride, which cannot be taken from us in any circumstances." As she surveyed her companions with a warm smile, the harsh cold seemed to soften for a moment. As the day began to fade, Barbara found herself alone again, leaning against the back of a large stone building. The stone wall offered some protection from the wind and a sense of security. Perhaps it was the sound of people passing by that gave her a sense of not being alone. Settling into a corner, Barbara pulled a small gold locket from her coat's inner pocket. It was the only keepsake she had managed to take from her former life. The clasp was slightly rusted but still smoothly open to reveal a photo from happier times: Barbara, her mother Dorothy, and the entire family in the library of their Upper East Side home. The edges of the photo were fading, much like her memories. Tracing her mother's face with trembling fingers, Barbara whispered into the night air, "I still don't understand." Her words formed a small white cloud in the cold air before disappearing. "But I believe the truth will be revealed." As the sounds of the city gradually subsided, Barbara took out an old paperback she had found in a donation box, a treasure despite its bent pages and water stains. Losing herself in the story allowed her a temporary escape from her harsh reality. Wrapped in her coat and several blankets, Barbara prepared for another night. Leaning against the dimly lit stone wall, she quietly embraced hope for tomorrow. "May I share warmth with someone again tomorrow?" As the hustle and bustle of Manhattan slowly quieted down, Barbara closed her eyes. A new day would begin tomorrow, and she would live it with gratitude, even if she was on the streets. Her spirit remained unshaken, for she knew that true richness lay not in material luxury but in the bonds with people and compassion for others. The dim light of a winter morning began to illuminate the streets of Manhattan. Frank Mitchell was, as usual, in the midst of his early morning volunteer work. His ID card, hanging from his neck, read, "Representative of Hope Shelter." He turned a familiar corner and entered a street along Central Park, stopping at an unexpected sight. A woman sat on a stone bench, reading a book with the poise of someone in the lobby of a luxury hotel. Her worn coat and faded scarf clearly marked her as a street dweller, but she exuded a special dignity. Approaching, he realized she was deeply absorbed in Shakespeare's As You Like It, not noticing Frank's presence. The edges of the pages bore delicate notes penciled in, a sophisticated way of reading. "As you like it." Frank found himself speaking. "You enjoy Shakespeare, then?" The woman looked up calmly and smiled. "Yes. This play especially teaches the strength to never lose hope, even in adversity." Her voice carrying a nostalgic echo of high society. I'm Frank Mitchell. He introduced himself, offering her a paper cup of warm coffee. If you may. Thank you, she accepted gracefully. I'm Barbara Wilson. I run the shelter, Frank explained. Would you consider visiting our facility? Barbara seemed to hesitate momentarily. It's kind of you, but... She chose her words as she closed her book. I still have things to do. Frank sensed a deep resolve in her gaze, different from mere resignation or pride. It was as if her circumstances held some significant meaning. Then at least take this, he offered, pulling out a warm breakfast sandwich. But on one condition. Barbara raised her eyebrows in interest. In exchange for this sandwich, could you read your favorite passage from that book? A gentle smile spread across Barbara's face at the unexpected request. A lovely exchange, she said, opening the book and beginning to read. Her voice carried a mysterious warmth through the cold winter air. From a distance, a woman observed them, Frank's mother, Martha Reynolds. On her way to a high-end boutique, she had stopped her car upon spotting her son. Seeing her son engaging warmly with a woman who appeared to be a street dweller, she wore a complex expression. This is. Martha instructed her driver to return home. She needed to consult her husband, Arthur. That evening, in their mansion located in Manhattan's affluent neighborhood, Martha was explaining the situation to her husband, Arthur, as the fireplace quietly flickered in the study. I'm worried, Arthur, Martha sighed. Frank always trusts people too much. If he continues to get close to the homeless. Arthur, deeply seated in an armchair, listened attentively to his wife, especially when she described the characteristics of the homeless woman. His eyes sharpened. What's the woman's name? Barbara Wilson. At the mention of the name, Arthur's expression subtly stiffened. However, he quickly put on a gentle smile, characteristic of a caring stepfather. Don't worry, Martha. He said, taking her hand softly. I'll talk to our son. You. Martha looked at her husband. Since their remarriage, Arthur had always shown concern for Frank, at least outwardly. Thank you for always thinking about Frank. We're family, after all. Arthur stood up, reaching for a bottle of whiskey. As he poured the amber liquid into his glass, he continued. Actually, this might be a good opportunity. What do you mean? Frank's, well, his passion for social contribution. We might be able to steer it in a more constructive direction. Outside the window, the Manhattan skyline began to glow with the light of dusk. Arthur, with a sly smile visible only from angles his wife couldn't see, mused to himself. The name Barbara Wilson carried an unexpected significance for him. And now, this coincidence might become an unforeseen opportunity for him. The next morning, as Barbara and Frank were once again exchanging words in the park, neither of them could have known. They were unaware that this seemingly trivial meeting was the beginning of a destiny that would greatly change their lives. And that a conspiracy, already in motion, was quietly manipulating the threads of their fate. In the chairman's office of Reynolds Investments, towering over Wall Street's skyscrapers, Arthur Reynolds stood before a large window. From here, he could overlook a portion of the financial empire he had built over many years. Social order or... He muttered to himself. On his desk, a research report on Barbara Wilson from a detective agency was spread out, alongside the financial reports of the Hope Shelter managed by Frank. Father, did you call for me? Turning around, Arthur saw Frank entering the room. He greeted his stepson with a broad smile and a warm embrace. Hello, Frank. I have something special to discuss today. Mother told me. She's worried about my activities. Frank said, looking directly at his stepfather. Yes, Arthur maintained a warm paternal expression as he gestured for Frank to sit on the sofa. Your passion is admirable. But sometimes, that passion needs to be guided so it doesn't run wild. Run wild, you say? Recently, this woman you've been close to. Barbara. Arthur chose his words carefully. I've looked into her. Frank's expression tensed. Why would you do that? As a father, I'm concerned, Arthur continued calmly, pouring water into a glass. You trust people's goodness too much. Sometimes, that can backfire. Barbara is different, Frank quickly countered. She is educated, and above all, she is sincere. Arthur sighed deeply, reaching for the documents on his desk. Exactly. That's what makes her more dangerous. What do you mean? Look at this financial report for Hope Shelter. Arthur placed the documents in front of Frank. Most of your activities are actually supported by our donations. Silently, Frank scanned the documents. Indeed, donations from the Reynolds family covered most of the operational costs. We are proud of your work, Arthur stood up, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder. That's why we want to protect it. What are you trying to say, Father? A simple proposal, Arthur sat back down, switching to a more businesslike tone. If you are truly passionate about helping the homeless, why not show it in a formal way? A formal way? Yes. For instance, through marriage. Frank's expression was one of shock. Marriage? With Barbara? It's both a test and an opportunity for you. Arthur continued in a soothing tone. It gives her a chance to reintegrate into society, and at the same time, it demonstrates the sincerity of your activities. Two birds with one stone, isn't it? Is this some kind of threat? Frank's voice turned cold. Not at all, Arthur shook his head calmly. But without our support, running the shelter will become difficult. And many people who rely on it. Arthur's implications were clear. Frank clenched his fists tightly. That night, Martha waited in the living room for Arthur. Did it go well? Her voice trembled with anxiety. Yes, Arthur replied, embracing his wife. It's for our son's future. It's necessary. Martha smiled, seemingly reassured. Her husband's consistent consideration for the family warmed her heart. But unbeknownst to her, a cunning smile formed on Arthur's lips. Later that night, alone in his study, Arthur was flipping through an old newspaper article. The headline read, Mystery of the Sudden Death of Wilson Industries CEO. An unexpected opportunity has come my way, he murmured in a low voice. Meanwhile, Frank was in his room, deep in turmoil. Faces of shelter users flashed through his mind, along with Barbara's dignified smile. What should I do? Under the moonlit window, he spent the night grappling with an unanswered question. In the Mitchell family's main estate, located in an affluent area of Manhattan, Martha was alone, tending to the roses in the garden handed down through generations. Even after 30 years of marriage into the Mitchell family, this rose garden remained her pride and a place of solace, even though she now spent more time at the Reynolds family's secondary residence. Mother. Turning around, she saw Frank standing there. It was a rare afternoon return for her son, who would usually be busy at the shelter. His honest gaze and distinguished features reminded her of the former head of the Mitchell family. Frank. Martha said, removing her gardening gloves as she gazed at her son's face. I heard from Arthur about the shelter. That's why I came back today. Frank replied, sitting down on the marble bench that had been passed down through the Mitchell family. I wanted to hear how you really feel. Martha momentarily stumbled over her words, remembering how George Mitchell, Frank's father, had passionately spoken about philanthropy in this very spot. Your work is the very tradition of the Mitchell family, she chose her words carefully. But times have changed. As Arthur says, charity in the new era must be more businesslike, right? Frank's voice was unusually sharp. Father didn't think so. George. Martha's voice choked up as she mentioned her late husband. Indeed, he did. But now it's Arthur's time. Without his support, the shelter's operations would. Mother, Frank said quietly yet firmly. Our family has always conducted charity work based on conviction, not for profit. Arthur doesn't understand that. At those words, Martha looked away from her son. Indeed, Arthur Reynolds was different. He had made his fortune through business acumen and had cleverly integrated himself into high society. Now, he was even trying to interfere with the Mitchell family's traditions. "Frank, please," Martha took her son's hand. "This isn't about compromise. It's a new form of social contribution. Saving Ms. Barbara and simultaneously protecting the shelter. Arthur's way. Is forcing marriage a form of salvation?" Frank quietly pulled his hand away from his mother's. The evening sun filtered through the stained glass that had been passed down in the Mitchell family, casting light over the rose garden. In that light, mother and son shared a long silence. That evening, Frank was waiting for Barbara in Central Park. He had something he needed to discuss with her. But how to choose his words? Barbara arrived on time. Even in her worn coat, her demeanor remained dignified. "Frank, what is it?" she asked in her usual calm voice. "You said you had something urgent to discuss." Frank took a deep breath. "Barbara, this is difficult for me to say." But before he could continue, Barbara quietly interrupted. "It's about Mr. Reynolds, isn't it?" Frank looked up, surprised. "Your father came to see me yesterday," Barbara continued, gazing at the trees lit by the park's street lamps. "He explained everything." "My father?" Frank's voice tensed. "What about?" "The funding for the shelter." "And?" Barbara paused, a faint smile on her lips. "The marriage proposal as well." Silence enveloped them. In the evening park, only the occasional footsteps of passers-by could be heard. "I accept," Barbara suddenly said. "What?" "The marriage proposal," she said, looking at Frank with a resolute expression. "Your shelter is a beacon of hope for many. If it means protecting it." "But that's wrong." Frank raised his voice, his emotions getting the better of him. "Not like this." "Frank," Barbara gently interrupted him. "Sometimes, people are forced into choices they do not want. But we can find meaning in those choices." At her words, Frank was at a loss for words. The strength and kindness reflected in Barbara's eyes were what had drawn him to her from the moment they first met. "I have something to protect," Barbara continued. "You have people to protect as well. So let's accept this situation, and then?" "And then?" "Let's find some meaning in this forced choice." In the evening park, they sat silently next to each other for a long time, contemplating the future they would have to walk together, even if it was not by their choice. From the window of the Reynolds family's study, Arthur watched with satisfaction. Even the heir of the Mitchell family moves when pushed this far. He muttered to himself. While securing his place in high society, he always harbored a secret rivalry with the old families. But what he couldn't see was the light of dignity and quiet resolve in Barbara's eyes, rivaling that of the Mitchell family, which would soon greatly disrupt his plans. At a party announcing their engagement at the Reynolds family's mansion, Manhattan's high society was all abuzz. The heir to a philanthropic family marrying a homeless woman? Was already the biggest topic in social circles. Is that the famous Barbara Wilson? Can you believe she really was homeless? But her demeanor. Barbara, standing with a champagne glass, was dressed in a lavish deep emerald green gown that showcased the Reynolds family's wealth, yet she wore it as if it were her everyday attire. "It's quite something," the wife of a department store owner remarked to Martha. "She looks like a born lady." "Yes," Martha replied, her expression complex with pure surprise and a hint of unease, and a slight doubt about Arthur's plans. Meanwhile, Barbara sighed deeply in the library, a bit removed from the party's hustle, gazing out at a well-maintained garden that reminded her of the Mitchell family's main home. "Is this okay?" Turning around, she saw Frank holding 2 old leather-bound books. "Yes, thank you," Barbara smiled. "The party is a bit stifling?" Frank nodded in understanding. "I feel the same." They sat down on the sofa in front of the fireplace. As Frank handed her the books, Barbara's eyes lit up. "First edition Shakespeare?" "Yes. It's been passed down in the Mitchell family." Frank replied, watching her reaction as she expertly handled the precious books. "Wonderful," Barbara murmured as she gently turned the pages, then suddenly began to cry. "Barbara? I'm sorry," she quickly wiped her tears. "I just felt nostalgic." "Nostalgic?" "Yes, but what it is?" Barbara furrowed her brows in confusion. "It's like grasping at fog." At that moment, the library door opened, and Arthur appeared. "Ah, there you were. It's a shame to miss the party." Barbara quickly hid the traces of her tears and stood up gracefully. "I apologize. I just needed a little rest." Arthur glanced briefly at the book in Barbara's hands. "New acquaintances are more important than old books. Come, everyone is waiting for you." After they left the room, Frank stared into the fireplace, deep in thought. Barbara's tears. Her natural reading posture. Her expert knowledge of the old book. "It's as if," Frank murmured to himself. "As if someone had taught her." Late that night, Barbara lay in bed in the guest room, wrestling with fragmented memories. The luxurious library. Stories read in a gentle woman's voice. The warm light of a hearth. But before they could form into solid memories, they faded back into the fog. At the same time, Arthur was alone in his study, staring at a clipping from an old newspaper. The social page from 10 years ago headlined, "Tragedy of the Distinguished Wilson Family." "It seems her memory is returning faster than expected," he muttered in a dark tone. "I might need to accelerate my plans." Moonlight streamed through the library window, illuminating the first edition Shakespeare, and on it, the faint traces of tears Barbara had unknowingly left behind seemed to beckon for the release of sealed memories. After the engagement, Barbara was to stay at the Reynolds mansion. Surrounded by luxurious furnishings, her life felt alien yet strangely familiar. That night, Barbara was troubled by uneasy dreams. "It's time to wake up, Mississippi." "Mother, shall we go to the library today?" "No, today is special. There's a board meeting." Fragments of memory danced on the boundary between dream and reality. Barbara woke up in a cold sweat. The bedside clock showed 2 a.m. Again, that dream. As she slipped into high-quality silk pajamas, Barbara stepped out onto the balcony. The Manhattan nightscape glittered like scattered jewels. Her days on the streets seemed like a distant past. Yet, her earlier memories remained shrouded in fog. The next evening, during a dinner held by the Reynolds family, the table was set with the finest china imported from France. "Do you like this Hermès dinner set?" Martha initiated conversation. "Arthur bought it recently in Paris. The detailing on the soup tureen is exquisite, isn't it?" Barbara responded instinctively. "Is it from the 1950s? A moment of silence followed. Indeed, Arthur raised his eyebrows. "You know about that?" Barbara was surprised by her own knowledge. Why did she know that? And why did the term soup tureen come so naturally to her? "Barbara, you are truly an interesting person," Arthur's daughter, Betty, sent a meaningful look her way. After dinner, Barbara once again found herself in the library. The first edition Shakespeare was still there. "So, you were here after all." Frank entered the room with a cup of warm tea in his hand. "Thank you." Barbara took the tea, then paused, recognizing the pattern on the cup. "Something wrong?" "This Wedgwood." Barbara clutched her head. "I definitely remember this cup, drinking with someone." A sudden headache made Barbara stagger, and Frank rushed to support her. Vivid images flashed through her mind. A luxurious study. An elegant woman holding a cup with the same design. A young Barbara. "Are you all right?" Frank's voice sounded distant. "Yes, just." Barbara took a deep breath. "I remembered something." "Remembered?" "But not clearly." Barbara looked out the window. It's as if someone is intentionally hiding important memories behind a fog. Silently, Frank watched her profile. It carried a grace he hadn't seen when they first met on the streets. Meanwhile, Arthur, watching through a surveillance camera in his study, couldn't hide his agitation. Faster than expected, he picked up his phone. "Margaret, we need to move up the schedule." On the other end, Arthur responded tersely. Yes, her memory is returning. We can't leave it unaddressed. That night, Barbara gazed at the stars from her room's balcony. Her fragmented memories were slowly taking shape, yet their meaning remained elusive. Who am I really? She asked, with only the night wind responding. At the same time, Arthur was meeting with Margaret Stone in a Manhattan high-rise. It's time for the next move, Margaret smiled coldly. Before her memory fully returns. Under the moonlit sky, the gears of fate were set to turn even more significantly. At a high-end boutique in Manhattan, Betty Reynolds was selecting bridesmaid dresses. But her mind was not on the dresses. Her father Arthur's instructions echoed in her head. Keep an eye on Barbara. Report anything unusual immediately. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror, Betty sighed. For 26 years, she had lived according to her father's commands. As the only daughter of a rising financial dynasty, fulfilling her father's expectations had been her life. That suits you well, Betty. Turning around, Betty saw Barbara standing there, clad in an emerald green dress, reminiscent of a socialite from a bygone era. Her presence carried a nostalgic elegance. Barbara. Betty chose her words carefully. What brings you here? Martha invited me, Barbara said with a natural smile. She wants me to get along with her daughter. At that smile, Betty felt a tightening in her chest. Why? It was as if she had known Barbara forever, a strange sense of familiarity welling up within her. Would you like to have lunch together? Betty found herself asking impulsively. At a high-end restaurant terrace, they looked down over the city. I've been having strange dreams lately, Barbara suddenly began. I'm in a large mansion, reading books with someone. Betty gripped her napkin tightly to hide the trembling of her hands. What kind of books? I can't remember clearly. But they're dreams that make me feel very warm. Those words stirred something inside Betty. She had fragments of similar memories. But were they dreams or reality? Meanwhile, back at the Reynolds study, Arthur was on the phone. Yes, everything is going according to plan. His voice was low and filled with tension. The date for the wedding is set. There's no turning back now. The response on the other end of the phone made Arthur's expression darken. I understand. We need to handle everything before Barbara's memory returns. He cut himself off when he heard a noise outside the door. Is someone there? Arthur called out. No reply. In the hallway, where Betty had been standing, only the faint echo of her footsteps remained. That night, Betty lay awake in her room. Barbara's words, her father's mysterious behavior, and the inexplicable sensations within her. Everything seemed to be coming together like pieces of a puzzle. Outside the window, the Manhattan nightscape sparkled. In that light, Betty was firming up her resolve. She was determined to unearth the source of her discomfort. Yet, she was unaware of how significant the cost of discovering the truth might be. Nor did she realize that this discovery would dramatically change everyone's lives. The harsh winter morning sun shone through the stained glass of a Manhattan cathedral. With only 3 hours until the wedding, the 19th-century cathedral was ready to bless yet another new beginning. The quiet solemnity of the morning was gently broken by the tuning of the pipe organ. Occasionally, a phrase from the wedding march would echo off the cathedral's stone walls like a trial run. The old wood scent mixed with the faint aroma of incense added depth to the air. Barbara was in the dressing room, surrendering herself to the hands of the makeup artist. Draped in a luxurious wedding dress imported from France, she looked every bit the highborn lady. The delicate lace embroidery glittered in the morning light. You are truly beautiful, the makeup artist exclaimed. Like stepping out of a painting, but... What is it? Barbara asked calmly. Your face, it seems familiar. I apologize, the artist hastily muddled her words. Barbara looked down momentarily. She had heard similar words often lately. Resembling someone. But who? Every time she pondered this, intense headaches plagued her. This morning too, she had awoken from the same dream. A luxurious reception room. A warm voice. Then sudden darkness. In the adjacent dressing room, Frank was quietly threading his father George Mitchell's heirloom cufflinks through his shirt sleeves. The initials GM on the platinum surface shimmered faintly. Frank, Martha entered the room, dressed in a Chanel suit that exuded the dignity of the Mitchell family. "Are you ready?" "Yes, Mother," Frank replied, looking at his reflection in the mirror. Would father have been happy about today? At his question, Martha's expression briefly clouded. What would George Mitchell think about marrying someone from the streets? Yet, the woman's mysterious dignity seemed as if she had been raised in a noble family. Her demeanor. "Your choice is surely the right one." Martha smiled, though her voice carried a slight hesitation. After her husband's death, she remarried Arthur, starting a new life, but occasionally her gaze still drifted to her original wedding ring. Meanwhile, Arthur Reynolds was in a cathedral room, clutching his mobile phone. The thick curtains partitioned off the space, his low voice echoing slightly. "Everything is on schedule," he whispered. "No one will interfere." After hanging up, Arthur's hand trembled slightly. The plans up to this day could start to go awry. That premonition filled his heart with unease. In the cathedral corridor, Betty walked quietly. Dressed as a bridesmaid, her mind swirled with the unease that had been growing since the previous day. Barbara's demeanor, her manners, her occasionally melancholic expressions. And last night, her father's puzzling behavior. All seemed to be awakening something within her. "Betty," her father's voice made her turn around. "Father." "Today is a special day," Arthur placed his hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, we must uphold the pride of the Reynolds family." His words rang hollow, as if trying to convince someone. As guests began to fill the cathedral, the elite of society mingled, their hushed voices exchanging words under the glow of chandeliers. "It's like a fairy tale. But that bride, she seems familiar. Something about the Wilson family." The last words were drowned out by a cough. However, those words definitely stirred someone's memory. The clock struck 10 a.m. 1 hour remained until the wedding. Barbara stood by a window, overlooking the cathedral's garden. Her pure white dress gleamed in the morning light. The cathedral bells tolled heavily. At that moment, a sharp pain struck her head. Something deep within her memory seemed to be awakening, slowly yet inexorably, like a consciousness emerging from a long slumber. Unnoticed by all, this wedding was set to unveil an unexpected truth. And this truth would dramatically alter the lives of everyone involved. The cathedral's pipe organ began to play a solemn wedding march. Barbara, clad in white, stood at the entrance to the aisle. Natural light streamed through the colorful stained glass, enveloping her like an angel's blessing. Frank awaited at the altar with a quiet resolve. His father's heirloom cufflinks reflected a faint light. In his heart, the spirit of philanthropy and the resolve to protect the one he loved shone brightly. As Barbara took her first step. "Wait." A voice of strength echoed through the cathedral. As the venue fell silent, a woman appeared in the central aisle. Detective Carroll was supporting her by the arm, a woman in her mid-50s, dignified despite her tired appearance, her gaze filled with resolve. "I am Dorothy Wilson," her voice resonated again through the cathedral. "And that bride is my daughter, Barbara Wilson." Barbara's pure white bouquet slowly fell to the floor. "Mother?" In that instant, memories flashed back like lightning. Reading in the luxurious library, warm moments with her mother, and that fateful night. Arthur stood up. "This ridiculous farce." "A farce, you say?" Detective Carroll stepped forward. "Dorothy Wilson has escaped from a decade of captivity to get here." The venue buzzed with whispers. "Barbara," Dorothy approached her daughter. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you that night." Hearing her mother's voice, something inside Barbara crumbled. Memories long sealed broke free like a dam bursting. "Arthur Reynolds planned everything, to take over our company." "Silence!" Arthur shouted, but his voice was already losing its power. Frank slowly walked towards Barbara. Everything has led us to where we need to be, his voice filled with quiet certainty. At that moment, a ray of light shone through the high windows of the cathedral, illuminating the cross on the altar. It was as if heaven itself was watching as the truth was unleashed from years of darkness. Betty quietly moved from her father's side to stand by Barbara. I've always felt it. Something deep was terribly wrong. Martha wiped away tears quietly, proud of her son Frank's correct intuition. A new calm descended upon the cathedral. It was the silence of dawn after a long night, filled with hope. When truth is revealed, it doesn't always come as a destructive force, sometimes, it shines as a light of healing. In that moment, everyone understood. This was not merely a disruption of a wedding. It was a moment when lost justice was reclaimed, and at the same time, it marked the beginning of new forgiveness and reconciliation. Detective Carroll was taking notes as Dorothy testified. At that moment, Arthur's smartphone rang. Seeing the name displayed, he paled. Arthur fumbled to silence the phone, his hands trembling. "Father?" Betty asked, troubled by her father's disturbed state like she had never seen before. Arthur didn't respond, just stepped back, sweating profusely. "I had no choice," he muttered, his voice trembling. His words were cut off by another ring of the phone. "Mr. Reynolds," Detective Carroll approached quietly. "Was someone else dictating your actions?" Arthur remained silent, glancing briefly at Betty. His eyes showed indescribable regret. "Mother," Barbara turned to Dorothy. "What really happened back then?" Dorothy gently took her daughter's hand. "There was one person who changed our lives." Arthur's body began to tremble visibly as the gentlemanly facade he had carefully maintained started to crumble. "Father," Betty approached quietly. "Tell me the truth." But Arthur couldn't respond. His eyes conveyed the weight of his long-held guilt and deep regret. Light streamed into the cathedral, illuminating the altar's cross. For the first time, Arthur seemed to be sincerely confronting the gravity of his sins. In a room at the Manhattan Police Headquarters, Detective Carroll was spreading out a newspaper article from 10 years ago. CEO of Wilson Industries dies suddenly. Management rights transferred with no heir. The contours of the case were emerging from the yellowed pages. Everything changed that day. Dorothy began quietly from a chair by the window. Her profile bore the marks of a decade's suffering but maintained its dignity. "After my husband's death, Arthur Reynolds supported me as a secretary. But one day, suddenly." Dorothy's voice shook. "I was imprisoned, and Barbara was left on the streets." Detective Carroll took meticulous notes, nodding occasionally. In her 20 years of career, she had seen numerous corporate crimes, but this case had a unique element. It wasn't just about money or power, a deep human drama was intertwined. "There was always one phone call behind Reynolds," Dorothy continued. "He was acting on someone's orders." And that voice. Meanwhile, in a cafe near Central Park, Barbara faced Frank across the table. Days after the wedding interruption, her memories were slowly becoming clearer. "It's strange," Barbara said, looking out the window. "The days on the streets were tough, but those experiences made me see what's truly important." Frank gently held her hand. "That's your strength." Just then, the cafe door swung open, and Betty rushed in, looking unusually pale. "Barbara," she gasped. "Father is hiding something." This morning, he was on the phone again. Barbara and Frank exchanged a glance. "I realized," Betty continued in a lowered voice. "I found an old photo in Father's study." There was definitely. But her words were cut off by a ringtone. The word "father" flashed on her trembling phone screen. Outside the cafe, the bustle of Manhattan continued, but around the three of them, a silence had settled as if time had stopped. In Detective Carroll's office, new information arrived. "We found footage from a security camera 10 years ago," a young detective announced excitedly. Near the Wilson residence, someone Reynolds met. Carroll leaned in as the video played. A woman stepping out of a luxury car, her movements marked by a familiar elegance. This is. Carol leaned forward, intrigued. The mystery of a decade was slowly but surely coming to light. On the top floor of Reynolds Investment, Arthur stood by the window overlooking the night skyline, clutching a newspaper in his hand. The headline illuminated by the dim office light read, "New developments in the Wilson family takeover case. Detective Carroll's investigation." Arthur hesitated as he picked up his cell phone, pressing a number, but then quickly turned it off. His hands were trembling. At that moment, the sound of the elevator rang out. "Father." Betty was standing there. Lately, she had been visiting the office frequently, concerned about her father's behavior. "Betty," Arthur hurriedly tried to hide the newspaper. "What are you doing here so late?" "There's something on my mind," Betty approached quietly. "I was looking at an old photo." It had. "A photo?" Arthur's voice stiffened. "Yes. A photo of you with Mother, Margaret Stone, and Mr. Wilson too." A moment of silence. The Manhattan night skyline stretched out, casting long shadows of the two. "Go home," Arthur said, his back turned to the window. "It's late." "But, Father." "Go home." His voice, usually calm, snapped harshly, making Betty step back. At the same time, in Detective Carroll's office, evidence photos were plastered across one wall, outlining the history of corporate takeovers. "Do you see it?" a young detective pointed out. "The same pattern in all these cases." Carroll nodded silently. Every corporate takeover involved Margaret Stone's investment firm, appearing as legal acquisitions on the surface, but the underlying truth was. "Look at this," Carroll picked up an old newspaper article. 2 months before Mr. Wilson's sudden death, Margaret Stone's fund began gradually buying up shares of Wilson Industries. In a corner of the office, Dorothy was reviewing documents when she suddenly stopped. "This photo." Dorothy's voice caught Carroll's attention. It showed Arthur Reynolds and Margaret Stone at a corporate party, with a young Betty standing between them. "No way," Carroll stared at the photo. "Betty Reynolds is her actual daughter," Dorothy finished. Late into the night in Manhattan, Barbara stood by the window in her room, reflecting on her days on the streets, silently praying. "Father's truth, I will reveal it." Turning around, Betty was there, her eyes filled with resolve. "Father and Mother. Margaret Stone. I need to know everything they did." Barbara silently took Betty's hand, their shadows merging in the moonlight. That night, everyone was facing their truth. Arthur amid fear and regret, Detective Carroll amidst a mountain of evidence, and Betty confronting the truth about her origins. Perhaps, as Barbara learned on the streets, the most crucial truths are seen in the darkest nights. Arthur walked briskly through the corridors of Reynolds Investment. Voices leaked from the boardroom, pausing his steps. If the Wilson case breaks in the media, the shareholders, and Margaret Stone's involvement. Arthur ducked into his office as if fleeing. His hand shook as he closed the door. The Manhattan skyscrapers, once symbols of victory, now seemed like countless watching eyes. The phone rang. Seeing the caller ID, Arthur's face turned pale. "Hello, Margaret," his voice trembled. "Yes, I understand. I have never." In the corridor, Betty overheard the conversation. Her father's weak voice and the cold voice on the other end weighed heavily on her heart. Late at night, Arthur sat alone in his study, looking at an old photo, a young himself with Margaret and a young Betty. "This was where it all started," he murmured. He was about to throw the photo into the fire when his phone rang again, this time from Detective Carroll. "Mr. Reynolds, may we speak tomorrow?" Arthur put down the receiver and collapsed into his chair. On his desk, a secret contract with Margaret and the records of stock transfers of Wilson Industries laid bare. Everything was in her hands. Outside, the moon rose in the night sky, its light silently but surely illuminating the darkness, much like the wishes of those seeking the truth. In the misty morning at Central Park, Betty stood where Barbara once survived the streets. The cold morning air caressed her face. Here, during that cold winter, she sat on the bench, feeling the weight of the truth her father had drunkenly confessed the night before. "Your mother directed it," his trembling voice still echoed in her ears. "Margaret planned the takeover of the Wilson family. And I drove Barbara to the streets." Betty fought back tears as she traced the wood grain of the bench. How many cold nights had Barbara spent here because of her own father? "Betty?" Turning, she saw Frank approaching with 2 warm coffees. So early, in such a place, Frank sat beside her, smiling gently. "Were you thinking about Barbara?" Betty nodded silently. "My father, my mother." She choked on her words. How could they bear the pangs of conscience? "You are different," Frank's voice was soft yet firm. Just then, Betty's phone rang. The caller ID read Mother. Margaret Stone was calling. Her hand shaking, she answered, "Mother." "Betty, it's been a while." Margaret's voice was as elegant and cold as ever. "Can you come home this weekend? I have something important to discuss." After hanging up, Betty's face turned ashen. "Margaret Stone, my mother," Betty turned to Frank. "She's a ruthless businesswoman who has taken over many companies. And now, is she targeting a new victim?" "Yes. But I won't let her hurt anyone else," Betty said, her voice filled with determination. "I have people I need to protect." That afternoon, Betty visited Barbara's room. Surrounded by simple but warm furniture, the two sat facing each other. "Tell me everything," Barbara said quietly. "The truth that lies within you." Betty took a deep breath and began to speak. Her childhood memories, her parents' relationship, and the many crimes they had committed. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "Barbara, I'm not blaming you," Barbara smiled gently. "On the contrary, I'm grateful for your courage." Outside the window, the evening light began to envelop the city. Their shadows leaned against the wall, together. "I've made a decision," Betty stood up. "I will gather evidence of my father's and mother's crimes. And then, I'll reveal the truth to everyone." Barbara silently took Betty's hand. In that warmth, Betty felt the bond of a new family. "Together," Barbara said. "Let's uncover the truth together." The light of hope was streaming through the Manhattan dusk. Sometimes the path to justice means breaking away from those closest to us. But Betty knew. This choice was the true testament of love and courage. Margaret Stone's penthouse was perched high above the Manhattan skyscrapers. In the top-floor reception room, she sat elegantly sipping a wine glass, looking down on Arthur. "Unexpected, isn't it?" Margaret remarked coldly. "I never thought Detective Carroll would gather so much evidence." "We might be too late," Arthur's voice trembled. "Too late?" Margaret laughed lightly. "You said the same when we brought down the Wilson family. But look, we won." Then, the elevator bell rang. "Mother." Betty stood there, no longer the obedient daughter she once was, but with a resolute and determined look. "Well, Betty," Margaret stood up gracefully. "It's been a while. Actually, I have a new plan." "That's enough," Betty stepped forward. "I won't let you hurt anyone else." "Really?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Arthur, what have you told your daughter?" Just then, Detective Carroll appeared, followed by Barbara, Frank, and Dorothy. Margaret Stone, Detective Carroll stepped forward. "We've gathered all the evidence of your crimes." "Evidence?" Margaret maintained her composure. "Everything I've done is perfectly legal." "Really?" Barbara spoke quietly. "Even locking up my mother and pushing me out onto the streets? Can you prove that?" "We can." Betty pulled out an old diary. "Here are my father's records. All the instructions, dates, and locations are meticulously noted." For the first time, Margaret's expression darkened. "Miss," Detective Carroll turned to Betty. "Will you submit this as evidence?" "Yes." Betty took a deep breath. "But first, Mother, why?" Margaret looked out the window. "The winner takes all. That's the iron rule of business." "That's not true," Frank said quietly. True victory lies in people's hearts. Pretty words, Margaret scoffed. To survive in this world. Mother, Betty interrupted. You're wrong. I learned from Barbara that true strength lies in caring for others. For the first time, Margaret really looked at her daughter. No longer a docile daughter, but a strong woman stood before her. Are you trying to take everything from me? Margaret's voice quivered slightly. No, Barbara said gently. We're just seeking justice. Outside, the setting sun painted the Manhattan skyline red. And within that penthouse, years of darkness were about to be illuminated. This wasn't a confrontation of violence. It was a moment when the good in people's hearts and a sincere desire for truth were about to take shape. In a small church facing Central Park, Martha was praying alone. The light through the stained glass gently illuminated her tears of remorse. Barbara. Turning around, there was the person she had been looking for. Barbara quietly smiled and sat down next to Martha. How can I apologize to you? Martha's voice shook. I knew, yet I believed Arthur's words, pushed my son and you. Martha, Barbara gently took her hand. You were also forced into difficult choices. Frank was always right, Martha wiped her tears. He had the ability to see the true nature of people. If only I had believed in his judgment at that time. But you're here now, Barbara's voice was warm. Isn't that what matters? The church bells chimed quietly. Meanwhile, in the visiting room of the detention center, Betty faced Arthur. I've told everything, Arthur said with a tired look. From meeting Margaret, her threats, and my own weakness. Why only now? She had been holding you hostage, Arthur slumped over the table. It started as blackmail. But gradually, I was enchanted by her power. By the time I realized, I had lost my own heart. Father. I don't think I'm forgiven, Arthur lifted his face, a genuine emotion in his eyes for the first time. But I thought, this is my last duty as a parent. To tell the whole truth. Betty silently took her father's hand. That evening, Barbara's apartment was filled with an unusual warmth. Dorothy, Martha, Frank, and Betty were all gathered in the living room. We're starting a new life, aren't we? Betty stood by the window next to Barbara. Yes. But not alone, Barbara surveyed everyone. We have a new family now. Family. Betty savored the word. I've lost my real parents, but I found true bonds instead. Sometimes, Frank said quietly. Losing something shows us what's truly important. Martha nodded deeply at her son's words, while Dorothy looked proudly at her daughter. Outside, the Manhattan skyline began to sparkle. The light seemed to gently envelop everyone in the room, like a symbol of new hope. Sharing is our pride, Barbara murmured as if recalling old words. Let's share hope now. Everyone in the room quietly nodded. Sometimes, the deepest wounds yield the most beautiful healing. And from genuine repentance and forgiveness, new bonds begin to grow. In the boardroom of Wilson Industries, executives sat tensely around a long oval table. Barbara stood at the chairman's seat once occupied by her father. The streets where she once lived as a homeless person were visible through the window. As of today, I, Barbara Wilson, will take over as the rightful successor to manage this company, she announced. Her voice was a blend of the strength she had cultivated on the streets and the innate grace she was born with. However, Barbara continued. This company will walk a different path from now on. A murmur rose among the directors. Pursuing profits is important. But there is something more important, Barbara looked at Frank, who quietly nodded from the back seat. We have a responsibility to society. Barbara pulled out a document. This is the charter for the new Wilson Welfare Foundation. But the shareholders. A director began to object. We have already consulted with my mother, Dorothy stood up next to Barbara. We have decided to allocate 30% of our profits to social contributions. The atmosphere in the room changed. Specifically, Frank stepped forward. We will focus on supporting the homeless, education, and entrepreneurs. We aim to create a society where everyone can have a second chance. And, Barbara smiled broadly. I would like to nominate Frank Mitchell as the co-responsible for this project. Martha looked at her son with pride, while Betty also smiled warmly. After the meeting, Barbara stood in her father's study, a place where she used to read books as a child. Your father's dream, Dorothy said softly, coming close, was to contribute to people's happiness. You are trying to shape that dream. Mother, Barbara took her mother's hand. The road ahead won't be easy. But you're not alone, Dorothy smiled. We have a new family now. True to her words, Frank, Martha, and Betty were there in the room. Sunlight streamed through the window, blessing their new beginnings. The first facility, Frank spread out a map. Shall we start here? It was the place where Barbara had shared food with many during her days on the streets. That's a wonderful idea, Barbara's eyes lit up. We can pass on what we learned there. Sharing is our pride, Betty repeated Barbara's words. On the bookshelf in the study was a Shakespeare book Barbara had read on the streets. Now, it served as a testament to her life. Wealth and status only have meaning when used rightly. A new wind was beginning to blow through the streets of Manhattan. It was a warm breeze that enveloped the hearts of the people. Warm spring sunlight streamed into the small church. There were no lavish decorations or crowds of guests at this wedding. However, the air was filled with definite love and hope. Barbara stood next to Frank, dressed in a simple, pure white gown. Both wore rings engraved with the same psalm. Love is patient, love is kind. The pastor's voice echoed quietly through the church. Dorothy, Martha, and Betty were seated in the front row, their eyes shining with tears of joy. Perhaps your meeting was guided by God, the pastor smiled gently. After a difficult journey, now, true love has borne fruit. Barbara and Frank looked at each other and nodded quietly. We want to share our love, Frank spoke his vow. With many people. And the light of hope, Barbara continued. We want to reach everyone who needs it. At the end of the ceremony, as the church bells rang out, the couple stepped into a new chapter of their lives. A few weeks later, a new shelter opened just off Fifth Avenue. The name Hope Sharing Center gleamed on the front of the building. Here, we met, Barbara said, holding Frank's hand and addressing the gathered crowd. And here, we learned what's most important in life. At the entrance, words in gold letters read, Sharing is our pride. The opening ceremony was attended by an old man who had shared food with Barbara and a mother holding her young child, among other new users. Hope shone in their eyes. In this center, Frank explained, we provide more than just meals and shelter. We offer job training and educational support. A place where everyone can start anew. Dorothy gazed proudly at her daughter. Martha watched her son's growth with quiet joy. And Betty, as part of the center's staff, warmly welcomed the new users. As dusk fell, Barbara and Frank stood in the rooftop garden, the Manhattan skyline aglow with the setting sun. Look, Barbara pointed to the sky. Like a rainbow after the rain. Indeed, a beautiful rainbow arched over the skyscrapers, enveloping the new center as if blessed by God. Hope always bears fruit, Barbara smiled. Yes, Frank nodded gently. And that hope grows larger when shared. In the garden, users had already gathered to start preparing dinner. Someone hummed a song, and children's laughter filled the air. The once cold street corner was now wrapped in warm light. This was not the end, but a new beginning. Barbara and Frank clasped each other's hands tightly. As their love had proven, the true light can illuminate any darkness, bringing forth new hope.